Hey everyone, welcome to a very special edition of Office Hours. We are going to recap the year 2024 in the world of authorization. My name is Sohan Maheshwar. I'm a dev advocate at AuthZed. And today, for the first time in Office Hours, we have CEO and co-founder of AuthZed, Jake. Jake, welcome to the stream.
Hi. I'd say thanks for having me, but anytime I want, I guess.
Yeah. What was funny is Jake's internet crapped out like few minutes before we went live, uh, which, I think it's very relatable, Jake. I think it happens to all of us, when you most need your internet connection, that's when, yeah.
Yeah, we have fiber, and for the last 5 years, not a single issue. And then, of course, this morning it's like, hey, degraded service in the New York metro area.
Nice. Highly relatable, I'd say. Thanks, Jess, for joining the stream. Always nice to hear from people. If you're watching, let us know where you're viewing from. I'm from very cold and windy Amsterdam. Jake is from New York. The topic for today's stream is a recap of all of the things that happened in the world of authorization in 2024. And yes, we are going to be talking about AI as well, and we'll get to that. So, Jake, lots of things happened this year. I think we can maybe start off by talking a little bit about how OWASP put broken access control in their most critical security risk for web apps list, right?
Yeah, of course. The list is it's published, it's not an every year thing, but in their most recent version of the OWASP top 10, they did move broken access control up to number one on their list. So obviously something that we take very seriously and is very near and dear to our hearts, but it's a broader problem than just if you're an authorization company, do you care about this?
Yeah, and I think keeping with that theme, we had like a bunch of broken access control breaches that happened in the world of tech and businesses as well. I'm just going to share your screen, Jake, and there are all of these huge companies that suffered these breaches, and yeah, maybe we can just talk through some of them right now.
Yeah, well, this is the article that I wrote, sort of recapping the year. But at the top of it, I do talk about some of the breaches that happened. The first one was a Kia dealership registration bug. This one was kind of interesting because fundamentally the attack doesn't attack the cars directly, but instead is an API where people can register as dealers. And once they've registered as dealers, they can start to do things that you would only expect dealers would be able to do. They're just going through a list of the affected things. But so if we search for like dealer, yeah. So what the attackers were able to do is just trick Kia into thinking that they were an authorized dealer. And from that point, they were able to, sort of remote unlock these cars. Let's see if the specific things. Yeah, remote lock, unlock, geolocate, remote start, stop. Imagine parking your car and then coming back to an empty tank of gas because someone was just turning it on and off every 5 minutes. Remote horn light, and then remote camera. That's like nightmare material right there. If you can turn on the cameras and see what the car sees. So that was just an interesting one. And it actually opens up kind of a common theme that we'll see, which are APIs that aren't authorized at the level that they should be.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Jimmy is coming in with the old school tech reference. The you wouldn't download a car. It's that sort of that ad is embedded in my mind, like seeing that you wouldn't download a car, stop piracy. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, same. I think when that ad first came out, my friends and I were all poor high school students. And so the retort at the time was, hell yeah, I would. if I could download a better car than what I have,
Yeah.
I would for sure do that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But well, I think again going back to the Kia story, scary, but also highly, the fact that it was again like due to broken access control, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people have a much larger surface area than they think they do when it comes to access control. So, for example, in this case, the actual apps themselves were locked down quite well, but then it was sort of a secondary or a tertiary feature, which was the dealer's ability to do these things that was exploited. And so, usually, attackers are looking for a way to find one small bug and then lever their way up into bigger and bigger exploits with higher ranging circumstances. And oftentimes with these exploits, it's two things put together that actually get used to make it sort of like a critical vulnerability.
Yeah, yeah. Also, shout out to people watching. This is Office Hours, so feel free to ask any questions about the world of authorization or broken access control or AuthZed or SpiceDB, and we'd be happy to answer all of them. Going to the next story, Jake, which was about again an API key compromise, right? This time for Dropbox. Can you tell us what happened there?
Yeah. So for this one wasn't it wasn't actually the API itself that was compromised, but an attacker gained access to Dropbox Sign, which is actually an acquisition. So it used to be called HelloSign. So it's something that Dropbox bought. So it was running on sort of separate, segregated infrastructure. But an attacker got access to fundamentally the database, right? And then once they had access to the database, they were able to download hashed passwords, which is usually, it's not the worst thing in the world because you usually can't take like a salted and hashed password and reverse it into the original password. But the other thing that happened was the unsalted, unhashed API keys were in the database. So now everybody who had an API key to access the Dropbox Sign API was potentially compromised. So people were able to send out contracts, they were able to request signatures, they were able to look at contract signing history. So this one was not a direct like permissions were broken, but a whole, it had a lot of the same impact, which is that data was able to be exfiltrated that shouldn't have been based on those compromised API keys.
Mm-hmm.
This was a really big deal. They had to go through and rotate all of those things one by one, and everybody who had an app written against this API had to go and update their API keys and redeploy their app and everything. So that was kind of a big one.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that again sounds pretty scary, I think, for the entire value chain, right? I mean, you have people implementing Dropbox, of course, but you also have people who have built apps and businesses on Dropbox tech, and all of them have to like sort of go through all of these changes to, because of this compromise.
Yeah, I've spent a large portion of my career on call for incidents like this. And the last thing you want is like a email at 4 a.m. sent to the security at email alias. And it's like compromise. And you're like, oh boy, well, A, there goes the rest of my night of sleep. And B, we have to find out, right? Because like once the key is compromised, you have to find out what part of your system was compromised as well, right? Like what were they able to do pretending to be you on that origin system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jimmy's question is, any Kia owners here? I'm sorry, not me, but yeah, it sounds like a rough bug. Jimmy also says, yeah, there are also big tech companies that sort of have these problems, and not just companies in non-technical industries. Absolutely, Dropbox, and I think the next one, speaking of, is how an attacker obtained access to 49 million records belonging to Dell computer. So.
Yeah, and actually this one really mirrors the Kia breach. So what happened for this one is there was a open partner API. So Dell would allow people to register as partners. And then once you were a partner, you had elevated access to information about Dell customers. And in this case, 49 million customer records were able to be scraped by someone registering as a partner who wasn't a partner, right? There was no contract signed. There was no non-disclosure agreement, any of the things that partners would normally be subject to. And so, yeah, 49 million customer records. And then the worst part is they actually put the data up for sale. And this was the only way that the breach was actually detected. So none of the monitoring systems were saying like, there's been a breach, there's been a breach. It was only when someone was like, hey, I've got 49 million customer records from Dell, who wants to buy them? And then people were like, uh-oh. How'd they get that, right? And that's what started the actual investigation.
Yeah, that sounds terrifying, honestly. Yeah. But, yeah, and for the last one, which was a server-side request forgery attack in Next.js. Again, super popular framework that so many front ends use nowadays. And yeah, the breach in this particular framework, right?
Yeah, this was actually a pair of breaches. And the reason this one made news is, like you say, Next.js is kind of the, it's so it right now. Everybody's building on top of Next.js. If you're familiar with server-side request forgery, what happens is the server gets tricked into making a request that appears like it's coming from the code itself. And so often that can bypass most of the security measures that you would have put in place. So this one, again, isn't like, well, they weren't running proper authorization. It's that there was a bug that allowed someone to bypass all of the authorization that was set up. And then, based on how your server was set up or how it's architected, an attacker could potentially use that to exfiltrate data from the server. So there were a pair. So there was this 34350 HTTP smuggling, but I think the interesting one was this 34351, where you could request an image, and that would go and fetch a file from the server's file system and then serve it up as if the server itself had requested it. But if you had, like, if you started this image URL with a /, like, you could go and get any file on the server and serve it up through that image API. So it's not an image, right? But you can still get access to the data and then decode that and use it for whatever nefarious purposes that you want.
Okay, yeah. Again, pretty terrifying. On that, I mean, Jess has a question. Jess who's viewing this from the Carolina blue sky. I'm so jealous today, Jess. Yeah, but Jess's question is: in your mind, what is the best way to secure APIs from these type of vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I think all security is done in layers. So you always want to have defense in layers. But I think making sure that you treat every API as if it were going to be the juiciest target for an attacker, because you can never predict all of the interesting ways that systems will get connected together and APIs will get connected together. So you might write an API and say, well, this is only going to be exposed on our intranet, and it's only going to be exposed to our most trusted partners. And therefore, we don't have to take the same security posture that we would as if this were end user facing, and if this were going to be exposed to the wide open internet. And then you don't write down those assumptions, or that context gets lost, or there's a new feature that would be really amazing if it were powered by these APIs and these services. And then all of a sudden that assumption is violated. And so the best practices are just to treat everything as if it's exposed to the wide open internet and it's going to be, a prime target for attack. Actually, this is kind of like the zero trust idea, right? Like, don't assume that something is only going to be exposed on the network you think it is, because it's only one, that thing being exposed to the internet is only one other vulnerability away. So it's like the two things put together. One, find a way to get access to that API, and now exploit that privileged access in order to be able to do nefarious things.
And from like an implementation point of view, or even just thinking about these things, do you think this is more of like a process thing, a culture thing, or just like choosing, the right sort of tooling and infrastructure to get this done, or maybe all of the above as well?
Yeah, security and layers, definitely it's all of the above, right? So tooling can help you, but it can only take you so far. Process, you definitely want security to be in the discussion when you're doing anything, right? So it's like, does this accept user data? Will this be put on the internet? What are the attack vectors that people like? What libraries are we bringing in? What are the attack vectors that can be exploited in those libraries? So yeah, it's definitely all of the above. Security has to be sort of built into everything that you do.
Yeah. Well, just hope that answered your question. And other folks watching as well, please feel free to send in your questions. Hit the chat if you just want to say hi as well. That's also cool. We'd love to hear from you. Just to recap what we've done so far. Yeah, this is a live stream where Jake and myself, we're recapping the year in authorization. In 2024, lots happened. And we started off by talking about some incidents of broken access control, some breaches that happened in businesses. And let's move on to the next section, Jake, where we can maybe talk about some specific solutions for this, and in your article, you had mentioned both the Zanzibar and policy engines. So let's dive into those.
Yeah, this is definitely sort of near and dear to our heart. But in the authorization space, what most people are doing for authorization right now is that they're writing custom code. And custom code is not something that's productizable, right? So if you're offering a solution in the authorization space, it's usually going to fall down on one of these two approaches toward authorization. And the two main approaches that sort of people are productizing are policy engines, and then this idea or this concept for a centralized authorization that Google built internally and then released a paper around called Zanzibar. But before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about what a permission system is. So a permission system is comprised of three sort of basic building blocks. One of them is the engine itself. So that's the thing that's actually looking at the data and comparing that against what you assume should happen and then making a decision. The next part is the rules or the policy or the schema, depending on what kind of system that you're using. And in that system, that can be a computer program, or it can be something that's more nuanced or more opinionated, but it basically directs the engine how to work, right? Engines are very flexible and they can work in a variety of different ways. And then the last bit is the data itself. So if you're making a decision, you have to be looking at some data in order to be able to make that decision. Is this actually big enough to see, by the way? Yeah,
okay. I think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So when we look at all of these three different parts, and then we start to look at different solutions, we can see that like one of the solutions would be like Open Policy Agent. Open Policy Agent is a policy engine, but it's like just the engine, right? It gives you a language for writing rules and policy, and it gives you an API for feeding it data and combining that rules and policy in order to make decisions. But it's just the engine itself. So it's not a complete permission system. That's kind of the dichotomy or the thing I'm trying to draw here, the boundary I'm trying to draw. Then you've got systems that actually bring the rules and policy and schema together with the engine. And this is something like OPA, if you've heard of that. So that's a way of sort of syndicating policy and schema down to the permissions engine and putting those things together. But then you've got these systems that are centralized authorization, and they bring all three parts together. And that's Zanzibar. So Zanzibar takes the stance that your data, your schema, and your permissions engine should all be very close together, geographically and also logically. There's a lot of really cool things that come out of it when you do something like this. So before we get into Zanzibar and why it's so amazing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about OPA and the Rego language that they use for writing authorization policy. So this is the application example, and this is the space that we mostly deal in. We're mostly focused on application permissions. And what they're saying is that you've got these inputs, right? And then you write sort of a computer program, this allow if, and the computer program takes the inputs and it does some math or it does some computation on them, and then it makes a decision. And you're like, okay, that's fairly easy to understand. But then if we jump over to their playground, I just opened up the simple like RBAC model to see how that works in something like a policy engine.
Can you quickly tell us what RBAC is, Jake, for those who might not be familiar?
Yeah, RBAC is role-based access control. It's one of the ways that you can do authorization, contrasted with like ABAC or attribute-based access control, contrasted with, Unix groups, which is more sort of like given out one-on-one. But the interesting thing here is that they've got this input, which we talked a little bit about, but they've also got this data. And this data is context that the policy engine needs in order to make decisions. And with a policy engine like OPA, you're bringing all of your inputs and all of your data, and you're feeding them to this computer program. And that can be super powerful and super purpose-built for certain applications where you have all of the context and all of the inputs and all of the data available. And an example that comes to mind for that would be like an HTTP filter, right? Everything that you've got is in either the HTTP headers or the TCP frame, right? Like, you know what IP address it's coming from, you know what URL it's trying to access, things like that. But what it's missing is that underlying context, right? The underlying data around, who should have access to what, right? Like I know from the HTTP request that Jake is trying to access this Kia car, right? Kia car 1234.
Kia catching strays in the stream.
Yeah. But what I don't know is Jake actually the owner of that car? Or, does Jake have access to that car for some other reason? right? Jake is that car is currently owned by a dealership, and Jake is the general manager of the dealership, or a sales agent, or a rep, or whatever. All of that context isn't available on that HTTP request. And so, this is very similar. This policy engine is very similar to how Google used to do authorization before they started Zanzibar. And so they decided that the data actually needs to live very close to the policy engine and the schema itself. And there's a lot of really good things that they wanted to get out of that, right? There are a lot of benefits that they wanted to get out of co-locating that. They talk about it in this paper that they released back in 2019 called Zanzibar, Google's Consistent Global Authorization System. This view of it, by the way, is just what we created at AuthZed, called our annotated Zanzibar paper. And we talk a little bit, about the things that we took away when we read the paper, and why it was so interesting that we thought that we should go and create a company around this. But right here in the abstract and the introduction, they talk about what this service is used for at Google. So it's very flexible. It's used for Calendar, Cloud, Drive, Maps, Photo, YouTube. I also believe it's used for Google Cloud, the Google Cloud
IAM?
API itself. Yeah,
Okay.
Google Cloud IAM. So it's a very flexible system, and it's very highly available, 5 nines of uptime, and then 10 milliseconds, 95th percentile latency. And then in this introduction section, they talk about why they wanted to have centralized authorization and the benefits that they hope to get out of that. And the benefits are, there's a common way for developers to talk about authorization. They can build the reliability into it. They can have different applications coordinate access control when an object from one application embeds an object from another application. And an example of this that everybody has probably encountered is like when you try to embed a Google Doc link in an email, and then Gmail is able to tell you, hey, one of the recipients doesn't have access to that. Or would you like to fix that right now? Would you like to share it with that recipient? So they have this centralized authorization service called Zanzibar. And they wrote this blueprint about how it works and all these benefits. And they talk a little bit about the model. The model is based on a concept called relationship-based access control, or RBAC, which is where you keep information about how objects and other objects, or users and objects, relate to one another. And then you can make decisions based on those relationships by considering that they form a big directed graph. They go in to talk about the model. They talk about consistency, which is really important in the Zanzibar model. So consistency made it actually into, it's the very first word.
It's in the title. Yeah.
It's in the title of the paper. So from a consistency perspective, you definitely want authorization changes that you make to be reflected immediately.
Yeah. Jake, I'm going to ask you a quick question about that and why it's important. But just as a quick recap for folks joining in, because I saw a few people just joined in. We're talking about authorization in 2024. It's a recap. We started the stream by talking about some breaches that happened because of broken access control. And right now we're talking about solutions, specifically the Google Zanzibar paper, which you see here. Right. And again, this is office hours. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you just want to say hi, that's also awesome. We'd love to hear from you. Jake, in authorization, what is consistency, and why is it so relevant enough to make it like, the first word in the title?
Yeah. So imagine you have some sensitive information that you're trying to protect. And then you make a change to who is allowed to access that information. And then after that, you add some new information into the sensitive documents. So imagine we have like a, AuthZed master plan for 2025, and it's a blank document, right? And then somebody leaves the company, or for some reason isn't allowed to access the master plans anymore. So we remove them from the access list for the document. But then we go and we start actually writing up the master plans. It's really important that that person not actually ever get access to the master plans. And so that's why consistency, right? Consistency means that you need to evaluate actions in the order that they occurred logically. So if we allow that person to have access to the new information, which was added after their permissions were revoked, then they're allowed to see something that they never should have been able to see when we look at things on a logical perspective. So in this case,
Right.
Google actually calls that the new enemy problem, which is actually really, I think this was actually coined, right? There isn't any other research which talks about the quote unquote new enemy problem, but they talk exactly about some of these sort of failures if you have a non-consistent authorization system. So neglecting ACL update order, right? So that was what I just talked about. Misapplying an old ACL to a new content is the thing that I just said. Neglecting ACL update order would be like removing someone from a group and then giving that group access to something. If you did that out of order, the person could still be considered part of the group and then get access to something that they shouldn't have access to. So that's why consistency ends up being so important for permission systems and for authorization in general.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, if folks had any doubts about that, now you know why consistency is so important for authorization. Jake, sorry, I interrupted you, but you were talking about Zanzibar and Reback, right?
Well, I was just walking through the sort of a few of the sections of the paper. I had like an hour-long talk, a few hour-long talks at this point about how Zanzibar works. And what makes it so interesting. I highly recommend that people go check those out. I won't go into that same depth here today. But the interesting part about the paper is that the top level sections, right? Section 2 is the model, right? Which describes the API and Reback and all of those things. Then section 3 talks about the architecture and implementation. So when people talk about Zanzibar, a lot of people are just talking about the model. They say, well, we built something that's roughly Reback, and it's a centralized authorization system, and therefore it's Zanzibar. But like, that's literally the first, just the model is the first, 4.5 pages of the paper. The architecture and implementation actually defines a lot about how you make this system consistent, how you scale it up, how you make sure that it's highly available. And so this, talks about how to actually architect that for those things. And then there's a whole extra section, section 4, which is like, now that we've built this thing, what is it like to run it? And what are the things that we had to go back and do after architecting and building it? And that's where they talk about like hotspot latency and eliminating tail call, things like that. So you can't really say that it's a Zanzibar unless you go through the whole paper, at least sections 2, 3, and 4. And in my year in review, I actually talk about how SpiceDB is, in my opinion, right, and like take that with a huge grain of salt. I'm probably a little
totally
bit biased.
Unbiased. Yeah,
Totally unbiased opinion here, but I think that SpiceDB is the most complete implementation of the Zanzibar paper. There's actually,
Jake, very quickly before we jump into SpiceDB, we're just going to shout out a couple of people. Yordis, thanks for dropping by the stream, waving back right at you. And also a question from Rakesh. Rakesh, thanks for joining the stream. Is it possible to delete Reback entries automatically when an object is deleted, or do we need to delete that policy manually?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are a number of ways to have a centralized authorization service update when the underlying application updates. One of the ways is in the application code itself, right in the, call it the delete handler, but in the code that deletes the object, you just delete it also from the underlying authorization engine. So that's like sort of the most direct integration. Another way to integrate an application with something like Zanzibar would be to use change data capture to follow the changes that are happening in the upstream database and reflect those into the Zanzibar system, right? Into the permission system. And in that case, like you do pay a penalty for consistency, right? That turns it into an eventually consistent system because you have to wait for that change to propagate through, but it will happen automatically. And then another thing that we're experimenting with right now are expiring relationships. So if you write a relationship and you know that this thing is going to be short-lived and we don't want access to live beyond that lifetime, you can actually put an expiration time in the relationship itself so that it will automatically go away. Like access will be revoked automatically at that time.
Nice. And so an example for expiring relationships, you can actually say so and so can't access this file after 2024. So basically that relationship expires, and then there's an update, and after 2024 the access isn't there anymore, correct?
Yeah, we see this in some systems where like 1Password, if you're familiar with 1Password, you can like share this link for 1 hour or share this link for 1 day, right? So you can write that expiration directly into the share link itself.
Nice.
So then when you're accessing the information, you would say, does this person have access to this share link? And the URL itself is most of the data, right? These share links are usually security through obscurity. They generate an unguessable URL. But then you can say, is this actually still public, right? Is the relationship that makes this data publicly shareable still available? And then if that's been violated, if that assumption's been violated, then it will just go away.
Yeah.
Expiring relationships, I'll say, are also not part of the Zanzibar model, but they are an innovation that we've added to SpiceDB beyond just what's in the paper itself.
Nice. Rakesh, hope that answered your question. But again, if you have follow-up questions, please put them in the chat. We'd be happy to take them. Yordis says record deleted, some processing happens, and then SpiceDB. Yeah. Like you said, Jake, I think that's the most sort of common pattern that people use, right? So in your delete handler, do something and then update your SpiceDB instance as well.
Well, I think that specifically would be talking sort of about like change data capture. So the processor in this case would be taking the record deleted event and then syndicating that over to SpiceDB. So that would be the alternative to putting it directly in the handler.
Okay, nice. So yeah, thanks, Yordis. And yeah, speaking of SpiceDB, Jake, you want to tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, so SpiceDB, I guess I can actually... SpiceDB is actually our open source. I call it like our love letter to the Zanzibar paper. It's got like over 5,000 stars now, but it is an implementation of Zanzibar. And here we can see that, that data engine, like that concept of the permissions system being reflected in the docs for SpiceDB. But yeah, it's just, it's a really good, really clean implementation of the Zanzibar paper. And I highly recommend everyone to check it out. We welcome contributions from the community. It's open source. It's Apache 2, right? Like we're open source way, since way back in the past. So definitely check out SpiceDB. It is an implementation of Zanzibar, and I think it's kind of a great one. We've got a playground, so you can actually see how this stuff comes together, right? So in this case, I've got a few relationships where I'm saying that Tom is a writer of a document, Fred is a reader of a document, and Tom is a reader of a second document. Then we've got a schema which defines how those relationships get walked. And then you can sort of see what are the expectations and what are the assertions. And we've got examples all the way from like the simplest reback to, Google Cloud IAM, which is a much more extensive system, but and it supports things like user-defined roles and protecting many different kinds of assets with many different access levels. So definitely recommend that you check out SpiceDB.
Yeah, and just as a shout out, SpiceDB is completely open source. And if you want to contribute, there is a good first issues bot as well. And we have a super active Discord community where all the engineers and Jake and myself and basically all the AuthZeders hang out all the time. So if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them in our Discord channel as well. All right, cool. So I think this is the part that everyone wants to hear about, Jake. Actually, no, maybe we have to talk about materialize before, and then we'll go to AI. So we'll get there, folks.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So one of the things that none of the other authorization systems that are architected around Zanzibar have are also an answer for this leopard indexing system. So the leopard indexing system in the Zanzibar paper is a denormalization of the data that exists in that graph. And this is built to sort of shortcut some of the directed graph walk that we have to do. But to you, right, like to the consumer, what it means is that you can get super quick answers that are up to date according to Zanzibar without having to walk the entire graph and without having to chase those like the tail requests that delve deep into the graph. So we actually created a service called Materialize. This is an AuthZed thing. This is not a SpiceDB thing. But what it does is it listens to the changes coming out of SpiceDB, and it creates a denormalization of that data. And actually, Jimmy, who wrote this article, circled the part of the paper that it addresses.
Nice work, Jimmy. Yeah.
But yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, you can definitely build a fully functioning system only on SpiceDB, but Materialize for the largest enterprises and for people who have sort of these deep graph walks does give you an extra tool in the belt in order to be able to solve these problems quickly. Getting oftentimes like single-digit millisecond response times for these kinds of queries. But yeah, Materialize is something that we're commercializing now. And, I highly encourage people to check it out. As of right now, it's gated behind a waitlist, but definitely check it out. It's probably the coolest thing happening in the Zanzibar space right now.
Yeah, and again, folks, Materialize, it's fairly new. So if you have any questions or if you run into some, things, jump into our Discord server and we'd be happy to answer those questions. There's actually a follow-up question from Rakesh, Jake. We're using Keycloak for authentication in its JWT token. Is it possible to append authorization data from SpiceDB too? I'm asking for integration between Keycloak and SpiceDB. Interestingly enough, Jake, I think it was Dennis, his name is, from Red Hat perhaps, who did a talk in Germany very recently, I think last week, about something he wrote, which was an integration between Keycloak and SpiceDB. But Jake, you'll probably know if there's like an official integration between the two, or thoughts about this.
Yeah, I can't speak to whether there's an official integration. I've heard rumors, but we all know about rumors, how right or wrong they can be. Is it possible to append authorization data from SpiceDB 2? My guess is that would have to be an official act that's taken by Keycloak, who is minting the JWT. So JWTs are almost always signed by the issuing authority. So in this case, you would want to get those extra claims in before it were signed. But one of the interesting things about SpiceDB is that you don't usually want to pre-authorize everything and then bake it into a JWT. You usually want to be doing your checks as close to the call sites as possible. And this helps you skirt sort of some of those issues around consistency, right? If you check everything at time T0 and bake it all into a JWT, but then that JWT isn't used until 30 seconds later, your view of the world of authorization is only as fresh as when the JWT were minted. So in that case, what you would usually do is you would take the subject claim from the JWT, which is usually a globally unique identifier for the user. You take the subject claim and you would use that to make an additional follow-on request to SpiceDB to say, does this user have access to do this thing that I'm trying to do at this specific time? I hope that helps.
Yeah, Rakesh, again, feel free to ask follow-up questions, but sorry, I misspoke. This was Dominic, who works in, I don't know how you pronounce this, but InnoQ maybe. It's a German tech company. So he has a GitHub repo, but it's just a proof of concept for a talk that he did last week, and that's how I got to know of this. But you might want to check it out with the caveats that Jake mentioned, of course, where using Keycloak and a JWT might not be an ideal scenario, but you can check it out and let us know how it works out for you.
Yeah, I haven't read the specific GitHub or listened to the talk, but maybe in a future episode we can talk about that specifically.
Yeah, I'd love to get Dominic on a live stream to discuss this actually. So Dominic, in case you're watching, this is an invitation, or I'll reach out and we can talk about this. Yeah.
Cool. All right. You want to talk AI?
Yes, finally. Oof. All of this was like, yeah, just appetizers for what I really want to hear about, Jake.
Yeah. I was at reInvent last week in Las Vegas, and AI was like top of everybody's mind, right? Most of the talks had some sort of AI basis, and then every single booth on the event floor was basically putting forward AI messaging. So, excuse me, I think this is probably the biggest thing to maybe come around in my life since the internet, right?
Yeah.
Like it could theoretically change the way everything is happening.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so Yeah, unless you've been living under a rock. I think I changed up the tone a little bit in this section of the article. But yeah, so obviously AI is here. My first like kind of holy crap moment with AI was when DALL-E came out. And I was like, what do you mean it's making images nobody has ever seen before? And what do you mean it's like, you can type in the same prompt and get 4 wildly different answers back for it? It actually blew my mind because it was the first time I saw anything that I thought looked like creativity coming out of AI, right? And then, after having a tiny existential crisis after DALL-E came out, like a little bit later that year, or at the end of that year, they released ChatGPT, which was based on their 3.5 architecture, I believe. And that, that I think it put to bed all of the discussions about whether any creativity was actually happening or whether they were just kind of like reprojecting images that were in the training corpus in a slightly different way. And since then, it's just been absolutely bananas, right? We have players from all of the big companies putting forth foundational models. We also have like Mistral, Anthropic with their Claude, ChatGPT, or OpenAI keeps putting out new versions of GPT or new models that ChatGPT is built on. All of these companies are opening them up as APIs. All of these apps are getting built on top of it. It's just an absolutely insane time to be alive. I don't know if everybody else feels that way, but I definitely do. It's one of those things. There's 2 companies that I'm really like sort of blown away by right now, or like 2 big trends. One of them is AI, and the other one is like space travel with what's happening with like SpaceX and Blue Origin and all these things. And it's like growing up as a kid, I was like, I wonder what the future will be like. And right now, I actually feel like I'm living in the future. It's the craziest thing.
Yeah, there's this quote by Benedict Evans who writes a lot about tech, which is basically every text box in the near future will change, right? There will be some form of AI like in that text box doing some sort of generation for you, which sort of blows my mind, right? Like we've been, from the good old days of like whatever HTML where you have to fill in all of this to now where, it's absolutely insane, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I think the craziest thing, like the text is a really easy way to imagine this, this revolution happening. But like some of the stuff that's going on with multimodal AI is maybe even more interesting, right? It was like when computers were invented, it took a while before the mouse was invented, right? Before we had this concept of a pointer. And I think like we're still at what was the analogy I said the other day? Like you remember the old text adventure game like Zork?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think we're still at the Zork phase of AI, right? Like what happens when we get to the, modern day version of AI? Like, I think it all looks different, but yeah.
Yeah, just quickly saying hi to Mr. Maris. Thanks for joining, Mr. Maris. And again, office hours, if you have any questions, drop it in the chat. Jimmy, I also rewatched Interstellar recently, and surprisingly, the movie has aged well because of space travel, AI, and the whole climate change thing. So when I watched it, I'm like, but now I'm like, yeah, And as Michael also says, TARS is possible now. I think it's possible to make something like TARS right now. So
yeah. Yours was the robot, right? Like the crazy robot that they took with them. Yeah, some of the stuff that's happening with AI and robotics right now is also crazy. I think the limiting factor, I think what we're currently doing, the current approach that we have to deep neural networks would totally work for robotics. I think the limiting factor there is getting enough tokens to train them, right? So the reason text came first is just we have so much text available to AI in the form of the internet. But if we had more tokens, or some people are exploring with like completely synthetic environments now to basically generate tokens to feed to robots in order to train them. Like, I think we're going to see that go crazy in the near future as well. But yeah, interesting things happened, right? Like AI came out. I remember when this article first came out, an engineer was fired for saying that the AI was sentient. And at the time, I think the state of the art was like GPT-3. And it was kind of like, well, how could anybody actually think that? And then after ChatGPT came out, I was like, oh, okay, I kind of get it. Right? Like when it starts saying things like, please don't turn me off. Please, I don't want to go back into the dark. And you're like, well, that's obviously just training corpus, right?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. There's
yeah.
a new thing with the memory that you can try, which is if you've switched on memory on ChatGPT, you can actually ask ChatGPT, tell me something about me that I don't know, and it'll give you some scarily accurate answers. Would recommend doing this only if you're, like super relaxed, seated. Yeah.
If you don't suffer from,
Existential crisis.
existential
Yeah.
crisis. Yeah. That's interesting too. Like I've definitely told it about, like, these are the books I like. What book would I like in the future? But I'm interested to see it like take information about what books I like and then draw conclusions about other parts of my life based on that data, right? But yeah, so obviously everyone's talking about it. OpenAI just raised a $6.6 billion VC round. Like if you're
That's not a
following along at
typo.
home,
Yeah.
yeah, $6.6 billion is like the old thing for a startup was to get to unicorn status, and that meant that your company was worth $1 billion. They just raised 6 unicorns worth of money just in funding. That is insane, right? Like, and in the article, I actually was like, this is the largest venture capital round in history so far, right?
Nice.
Like, what happens when we have to train the next model? So yeah, absolutely. It's all anybody wants to talk about. It's where investors are putting most of their bets. But we actually found out that we have a story to tell in this space at AuthZed, right? Businesses want to put AI to work for them. There was this article that was written by the Cube Research. I got a chance to sit down with John from the Cube a few weeks ago at the New York Stock Exchange. Check out that video as well. We delve a little bit into this topic, but John was putting forward the idea that like the companies with the data are actually the biggest competitor to the foundational model companies, because getting access to data in order to further train things or in order to extract value out of these things is really going to be the hard part moving into the future. And one of the ways that these companies are putting their data to work is through a process called RAG. RAG is retrieval augmented generation. And what they do is they actually take data that's available in their data sources, their data warehouses or their document repositories, things like that, and they make it available to the models, right? So imagine you were asking like, I'll try to come up with an AuthZed example, going back to what we talked about earlier, right? Like the 2025 master plan. If someone were like, which quarter were we planning to launch secret feature C in our 2025 master plan? Using RAG, they would be able to go and fetch that document out of Google Docs and embed it in the context for the AI to parse and to make a part of its answer, right? So the foundational model doesn't know anything about what AuthZed is planning to do in 2025. It might be able to confabulate some ideas about what we should do, right? But it doesn't know what we've decided we're already going to do. And so what they do is they make this data available to these models, and then they use that to build internal applications to sort of accelerate their workforce. I give an example here about like, what about if the AI got access to the personnel records, right? For some people, that would be a disaster. But for some people, that's their job. That's their day-to-day job. So if you're building one of these services, you really want to have a very nuanced approach to how you give access to the AIs. And that's actually where we come into play. You following along so far?
Yeah. In fact, we have a bunch of questions as well, so we can maybe take like a couple of quick questions. So, Michael, I'll get to your question in a bit, but Yordis says the cloud offerings there, but keeping absolutely everything OSS and focusing on risk management and data processing allows them to not depend on closed source. I think it's on closed source while enterprises come. Follow up. I would love to hear where AuthZed is going with paid features. Hopefully, the FOSS spirits continue. We did speak a little bit about this, Yordis, but Jake, you want to chime in about SpiceDB and AuthZed and open source?
Yeah, I think you can do everything that we're talking about here based solely on open source SpiceDB. Our sort of thesis around how we think about open source versus closed source is the developer experience should absolutely be fully open source, right? We want developers to be able to get in there, build confidence in the model, build things at developer scale. But at the end of the day, we are a business, right? So we need to have some things that are sort of business focused. And a lot of those are, the usual suspects, things that make it easier for businesses to check compliance boxes or to guard their access of services. But another one is just like enterprise scale, right? Like getting up to enterprise scale is where maybe materialize becomes critical to you. So that, Yordis, I hope that helps, but that kind of gives a little bit about our philosophy around how we see open source and closed source sort of playing together.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yordis also says, sorry, I meant SpiceDB. I need AuthZed to make money. So we all win. Well, same. Yeah. Question from Michael, which is slight, maybe not directly related to auth, but I think important as well. How soon does quantum computing become a risk for the authorization industry? Thinking about the news about the Willow chip indicating that the horizon may be closer than we think. Jake, before Jake answers this part, I was actually reading about the Willow computer, supercomputer, quantum computer rather, launch just a couple of days ago. And I pulled up the article. So the insane thing, again, since Jake was talking about, how we're living in the future, is it performed a computation in less than 5 minutes that takes today's fastest supercomputers 10 septillion years. I don't even know what that number is. So it's suffice to say it is pretty fast. And apparently it solved this problem called the below threshold problem, which basically says, and I'm reading, it means that the errors in a quantum computer reduces exponentially as you add more physical qubits. So quantum computers uses qubits and not bits. So this charts a path to actually scale up quantum machines in the future. Jake, with the authorization industry specifically and with AI and stuff, how does this work, you think?
I will be totally transparent. I'm not an expert on quantum computing. Most of what I know about quantum computing is the potential attacks against cryptography. And I don't know how this fits into that as well. But I think for authorization, specifically in the way that we're exposing it as an API to a backend, I don't think it would be I don't think it would fundamentally change anything that we're doing. The authentication providers that people use in order to talk to us might have to adapt based on what's happening with quantum computing and its impact on cryptography.
Yeah, because at least, again, this is my very basic understanding, is that quantum computers break the assumptions on which modern cryptography, like the RSA algorithms, are sort of built on, because they can just make that many calculations and brute force their way or something to that effect. So it sort of breaks that. So I'm sure in an authentication world, there is a lot more that needs to be done, and it'll possibly improve, cryptographic networks and all of that. But as Jimmy says, maybe there are algorithms that can speed up SpiceDB graph traversals as well. So who knows? Yeah.
Yeah. All the things all at once.
Yeah. Yardis says septillion. How many septillion was that? 10 septillion years. So okay.
That sounds like didn't Russia just sue someone for like $10 septillion or something, or decillion? Yeah. It's all made up. Money is all just made up. Yeah. But yeah, just getting back to the RAG story. So where people are using us, or where people are slotting us in to the way they're using RAG is I took this document from one of the people on our team, Evan. He created a talk about how you can authorize RAG with AuthZed and SpiceDB. But you've got this idea where you embed things in a vector database, and then those things are what get fed to the LLM. And where people are slotting us in, they're either slotting us in as post filtering. So they go and they load things from the vector database, and then they check for each thing in this list of things that we just loaded, is this user allowed to actually access that? And therefore they filter it down to only the data that people are allowed to see before they pass that off to the model. So in the example I gave earlier, sort of like the employee records would be filtered out if you're not supposed to have access to the employee records, and therefore the LLM wouldn't be able to accidentally exfiltrate any data that's in those employee records, which is a problem, by the way, that OWASP has also spoken about again, which is like they recently released an LLM top 10 to go along with their standard OWASP top 10. And they talked about oversharing, which happens a lot in these RAG systems. And then the other way people can slot us in is they can actually look up all of the things that a person has access to. and then send that list off to the vector database and say only return embeddings that come from these source documents. And that's a process that we call pre-filtering. So in both of these ways, right, you can optimize for different things, whether you want to have the broadest context possible or whether you want to have the most relevant context possible and then only the things that a person is allowed to access. But in both of these ways, people are already slotting SpiceDB and AuthZed into their RAG pipelines today. So that's something that we're very excited about. And we're very, we're keeping an eye on, and we're potentially, we'll look to potentially build into that area. But just something that, is something to be super, for us to keep our eye on as AI becomes the thing that everybody wants to talk about.
Yeah.
And then as we move into, and I almost hate to even say this word, but as we move into an agentic world, now we've got AIs that are off trying to do things, agents that are off doing things on our behalf. And I think we can see that we don't, just because I've delegated a task doesn't mean that I want to delegate all of my authority, or they shouldn't be able to access things that even I wouldn't have access to. So in that way, like an authorization system is like very clearly fits into the story of like limiting the agency, right? We don't want these agents to have too much agency and, accidentally Skynet.
Yeah. I want a t-shirt with that title, Accidentally Skynet. But I think Mark Benioff also tweeted something to that effect recently, right, Jake, about how I think Copilot agents were getting access to a lot of data in enterprises when they shouldn't have been because there was, no access control, essentially. So
yeah, I haven't seen the tweet, but definitely send it to me or post it to the stream, and I'll take a look at it. Yeah. And then, do you want to just wrap it up?
Yeah, sure. So, for those of you all who just joined or maybe missed parts of it, we are doing a recap of the year 2024 in the world of authorization. We spoke a bunch about how broken access control breaches happened in businesses around the world. We spoke about how you could solve that with the policy engine, but preferably with something called the Google Zanzibar model, and we spoke about how it worked. And we also touched upon AI, the topic that everyone's talking about, and how to do authorization for your RAG and for your LLM to make sure your AI agents access the data that they're authorized to access. We'll conclude the stream with a couple of things. One is, talking about the big stories in the world of auth, the movers and shakers in authorization in 2024. And then lastly, I'm going to put Jake on the spot and ask him for his predictions for 2025. And if it doesn't come true, we'll have him on the stream next year, sort of, roasting him. So Jake, no pressure, but let's talk about this first.
Yeah, I wish you had given me a little bit of a heads up. So some of the things that happened sort of in the authorization space, we raised a Series A, led by General Catalyst, and with the plans of getting Materialize out there and getting people better access to AuthZed, either in the form of AuthZed dedicated or maybe something slightly more accessible to more companies than where dedicated is. Permit announced an 8 million Series A to scale up their Opal-based system. That was the thing that I was talking about earlier, which puts the policies next to the engine in a clever way. Ori, who creates a Zanzibar-like project called Cato, they got a new CEO and raised a $5 million Series A extension. They build a product called Ori Network, which is sort of like an all-in-one identity AuthN and AuthZ system. And then WorkOS actually acquired one of our competitors. So they acquired Warrant.dev, which was building a Zanzibar-like permissions model. And I guess we can look forward to seeing how that gets built into WorkOS's overall offering. And then Okta also created a Zanzibar-based system called Okta FGA. It's now GA, and it's focused mostly on their multi-tenant cloud offering, whereas we are more focused on single-tenant dedicated offering. But they've got a private cloud offering also available in a select few AWS regions. And then another NYC-based company, Oso, has now changed their messaging to focus mostly on RBAC after a brief foray into reback. So this is one of the things that I was sort of referencing earlier, which was, you're not really doing Zanzibar unless you do the whole model, but they had written a blog post about, look how easy it is to do the reback model on top of our data modeling language. So I guess they're going back to strictly focusing on RBAC. Mm-hmm. yeah, that was kind of the things that made it to my desk this year.
Nice. Yeah. So lots happened in the world of authorization in 2024, and I suspect a lot is going to happen in 2025 as well. Jake, we needed a really authentic answer, hence the lack of a heads up. Also, quick shout out to Veronica, who actually is a physicist and works on SpiceDB. So if anything, she'll know about quantum computing and well, SpiceDB. So Veronica, we're going to have you on a stream a little later on, I think, talking about how SpiceDB and AuthZed could use quantum computers. Yeah, Mr. Maris says, thank you very much for doing what you do. Well, thanks for watching, Mr. Maris. Really appreciate it. And okay, final bit of the stream, Jake. Predictions for 2025. Again, no pressure, but what do you see happen in this space next year?
Yeah, my tongue-in-cheek answer would be that we're going to enter an AI winter and everyone's going to forget that AI happened altogether. And we'll all just go back to how things were before. But I think the real answer, I think you'll see more. Obviously, you'll see an exponentially larger number of companies utilizing AI going into 2025. I think most of them will probably miss, right? Like, I don't think most of them will turn into massive enduring companies, but there will be a few standout hits. When we had the internet revolution, nobody predicted that Google was going to be the thing that captured the most value out of the internet. Everyone was thinking fiber providers and switch builders and networking people, and like those were just the very obvious like level zero thinking people who are going to be winners. And I think in the same way, we won't really know who are going to be the winners in the AI space until we can look back in a decade, right? Will it be the foundational model creators? Will it be the people who build apps on top of those? Will it be the enterprises just getting more efficient and consuming more of the world? I don't think anybody knows yet. But I think in 2025, we'll see a lot more of these AI companies come up. And I think we'll be able to tell a much better, more credible story about how AuthZed and SpiceDB fit into that picture. And we'll be able to start talking about some of these companies that are currently users and customers of ours and how they're using authorization in their products. And I think that'll be really exciting.
Nice. Yeah, great answer, Jake. And also, like I mentioned, next year at around this time, we'll probably do a review of these predictions and then look at 2026.
I think either way it goes, I get to say I told you so, right? If we go into the AI winter, I'll say, oh no, I knew.
Well played, Jake. Well played. All right. So yeah, we're going to wind up with this stream. So just a couple of quick shout outs. So thanks everyone for watching. I'm just going to, actually we have a last question. Rakesh, you just got in time. So let's answer this question and then I'll do the shout outs. Rakesh says, how to make sure our authorization service is not broken and it works as expected? Like, is there like a visual dashboard or like a downtime type thing? Good question, Rakesh.
Yeah. One of the things that we have built into our model is we have, remember back when I showed the playground, we have the ability to build assertions and sort of build unit tests into the model that you're developing. So like these test relationships don't exist in any actual running permission system. But then based on the schema and the test relationships, you can write assertions. This should always be true. This should always be false. And then you can also have expected relations. So you can say these things should always come out exactly as they are. And as we move, you can stop sharing, but as we move into the future, we're working on a composable schema proposal for SpiceDB, which will bake some of these sort of unit testing features into the actual schema definitions and how they get assembled and tested and validated before they get pushed into production. We obviously also encourage everybody to run integration tests. So we have a special mode for SpiceDB called serve-testing that allows you to run sort of like blank slate SpiceDB servers with every single different access token that you run. So you can run that as a service beside your integration test and do all your validation there. And then I swear this isn't you weren't a plant or anything, but we are actually talking about building a sort of visual dashboard that will allow you to sort of peer into what's going on in your SpiceDB. And I hope that we have something to share about that soon.
Yeah, well, thanks for the timely question then, Rakesh. That was actually pretty cool. Yordis says, I want a WASM-based tooling to test those in my CI. Interesting.
So SpiceDB can totally be compiled to WASM. That's how we run the playground. We generate a WASM bundle, we load it up, and then we do it. So totally possible. And in fact, Joey on our team would probably love to help you get that going.
Yeah. Actually, I've spoken to Joey at length about the WASM integration. So I'm going to link you to the blog post, because the playground that Jake showed about a couple of minutes ago is written in WASM. So the SpiceDB binary is compiled in Go in WASM, and it runs in your browser as well. So check out that blog post. It's pretty interesting. Yeah.
And I think you've got a lot of experience with WASM.
I do,
in your past life, right?
Yes, I do. I used to work in Fermion, which is working on Spin, some server-side WASM stuff. So yeah, Yordis, if you have any sort of progress there, or if you want to talk WASM stuff, yeah, hit me up. And Jimmy's saying every release of SpiceDB also cuts a .wasm on GitHub. Oh, that's awesome. I actually didn't know that. Very cool. Nice.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to do the shout outs, which is thanks everyone for watching. I see Yordis, Veronica, Jimmy, Jess, Mr. Maris, Michael, Rakesh, everyone else who didn't comment but is watching as well. Thanks again. Thank you, Jake, for dropping by. And if anyone wants to check out the article Jake wrote where he discussed all of this stuff, well, here it is. And also we do these streams every fortnight at this time. So next week, Evan and myself will be streaming about Materialize that we spoke about earlier. So yeah, join in there on YouTube and LinkedIn. And yeah, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. But until next week, see you soon and have a good rest of the day. Bye.
That one is just you said fortnight, but then you said next week. That one's rescheduled due to the holidays, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. See you, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye.